The Crusades are typically framed as epic clashes of faith, driven by religious zeal and the promise of spiritual salvation. While belief was the powerful spark, it was not the engine that sustained these monumental expeditions. That engine was money. The story of the Crusades is fundamentally a story of financial innovation, a story where faith mobilized the masses, but finance determined the outcomes, permanently reshaping the structures of power in medieval Europe. In 1095, Europe was a poor and fractured continent. Wealth was locked in land, not cash. There were no national treasuries or tax systems capable of funding an international war. Yet, Pope Urban II's call to reclaim Jerusalem ignited a movement that would see tens of thousands travel thousands of miles. This presented an impossible financial challenge: how to pay for weapons, ships, food, and years of logistics for a decentralized, cash-poor society. The answer was a massive, spontaneous liquidation. Knights and nobles, driven by a potent mix of piety, honor, and social pressure, financed their own salvation. They sold or mortgaged ancestral lands, often at steep discounts to monasteries or wealthy neighbors. They borrowed from moneylenders and pledged future incomes. This created a crucial, quiet shift. War stopped being merely something you fought. It became something you financed. And where there is financing, intermediaries emerge. Italian maritime republics Venice, Genoa, Pisa were the first to spot the opportunity. They were not crusaders. They were service providers. They sold the ships, the transport, the supplies, and the credit. Crusading routes rapidly evolved into protected trade routes. Ports grew rich, shipbuilding boomed, and a vast logistics industry was born, profiting from the movement of zealots regardless of their military success. The Church, observing this, underwent its own financial transformation. To fund ongoing campaigns, it authorized novel forms of taxation on clergy and laity. It offered spiritual indulgences in exchange for financial contributions instead of military service. Emergency fundraising hardened into a recurring revenue stream, leveraging belief to build a cross-border fiscal authority that kings envied. The most sophisticated financial operators to emerge were the military orders, particularly the Knights Templar. Founded to protect pilgrims, they evolved into a pan-European banking network. They accepted deposits, managed assets, issued letters of credit, and transferred funds across continents. They were, in effect, the first multinational corporation, wearing armor but thinking like bankers, extracting value from the constant state of holy war. The raw logic of finance ultimately overpowered the original religious mission. The Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, laid this bare. Contracted to Venice for transport, the Crusaders could not pay their bill. Venice did not forgive the debt. It redirected the entire army. First, it forced them to sack the Christian city of Zara. Then, they were diverted to conquer and brutally loot Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world. The crusade had not failed spiritually. It had simply followed the money, with catastrophic results for Byzantium and enormous profit for Venice. This pattern set the template. The system began to sustain itself, often at the expense of its original purpose and its most vulnerable participants. While Italian merchants and military orders profited from the continuous flow of capital and contracts, the costs were brutally asymmetrical. Individual crusaders returned bankrupt or died in debt. Peasants bore higher taxes. Jewish communities, often acting as lenders, faced violent scapegoating when debts came due. Wealth consolidated upward, land was transferred to institutional hands, and Europe's economy was reorganized under the pressure of perpetual war finance. By the time the last Crusader stronghold fell at Acre in 1291, the religious fervor had faded, but the financial architecture built to support the Crusades did not. It had become too useful. The mechanisms of church taxation, state war finance, international credit, and maritime logistics were repurposed. Europe had learned an indelible lesson: how to convert moral certainty into liquid capital, and how to build institutions that profit from sustained conflict. The legacy of the Crusades, therefore, is not found on the maps of the Holy Land but in the ledgers of power. It is the story of how belief opens wallets and how systems, once created to fund a holy cause, can outlive their original mission and become self-perpetuating engines of extraction. Modern conflicts, framed in different ideological terms, often follow a familiar blueprint. Moral language mobilizes support. Complex financial systems distribute risk and profit, and the machinery of war continues long after its initial justification has faded. The Crusades taught the West that once violence is fantasized, it becomes a sustainable enterprise, a dangerous lesson whose echoes we still hear today.